Welcome, listeners, to another enlightening episode of Untethering Shame, where we unravel the intricate layers of our emotional landscape with compassion and insight. Today's episode is another powerful one that I can't wait to share with all of you. Joining me is the esteemed Erika Malm, a seasoned therapist with a wealth of experience in trauma treatment and attachment theory. Erika's expertise in helping individuals connect with their sense of meaning and navigate daily challenges is invaluable as we navigate the complexities of eating disorders in today's conversation. So in this episode, Erika and I discuss the barriers to embracing eating disorders and why they're not talked about, just really at all, and why that's so important as we start a conversation to be highlighting the fact that this is one that looks a little bit different and needs to be happening more. We explore the misconceptions and myths surrounding eating disorders and the need for validation and empathy, both for those affected and, moreover, as a norm in our culture. We looked at the role of control and the underlying pain that drives disordered eating behaviors and, interestingly enough, used my own recovery as a means of exploring just how deep those eating disorder thoughts can exist in the psyche. The conversation isn't your typical eating disorder conversation. We didn't give you facts. We didn't lay out the symptoms. We didn't tell you things that you could just sit and Google. Instead, we highlighted the importance of addressing the emotional needs underlying eating disorders and the need for compassionate and understanding approaches. We explore the importance of understanding the underlying pain and trauma that often drives disordered eating behaviors and emphasize the need for empathy, validation, and emotional processing in the healing space. We also got to touch on the role of the therapeutic relationship, and we talked about something that Erika mentioned called the healing container and why it's so important that we are mindful of and diligent in creating that container. The conversation encourages listeners to hold on to hope and to be patient with themselves as they navigate their own healing journeys and as we learn how to show up for other people in our lives as well. Now, when I say that this is one that we can all learn from, I mean it. So I want you to show up fully. Take a second to tune into yourself, disconnect from anything and anyone that might impede you from really being here and with us in this conversation. And let's dive in. Erika, I'm so excited that you're here. I am so looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, thanks, Kyira. I'm so happy to be here with you.
So I love to start every episode just doing a feelings check, just getting a vibe for where we're at. And I'm curious if you could describe how you're feeling in this moment using one word. What would it be?
Nervous.
Nervous. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the part of me that wants to keep it as a one-word check-in is like, so you say nervous and then you let it be. The therapist part of me that goes, I want to process that and I want to know what's going on, wants me to ask more questions, but I'm going to let it just sit there and let that just be.
Okay.
So I'm really excited for you and I to dive into this conversation. And I think, both you and I believe we need to be talking about eating disorders more. We need to be putting more information out into the world. We also know, even though this is one of the most important mental health diagnoses that needs better information and more treatment and more access to the information, it's still something a lot of people are scared about talking about, get a lot of misinformation around. There's just so many barriers to this being a more normal topic. And so I'm curious for you, what do you think gets in the way of us embracing eating disorders at the level that we need to? Why are we not talking about it enough? Why are we still so confused? Why are we not treating it at the level of respect and acuity that we should?
Mm-hmm. What's percolating right now for me is the way in which we, I think as a culture, tend to construct eating disorders, and so much of it, and particularly anorexia, in which we talk about it in terms of control.
Yeah.
And I think that there's just such an inherent criticism. Whoever uses the word control or calls someone needing control or controlling, we were just talking about
right.
finding for control before this started this.
Yes.
But whoever talks about that without judgment, right? It doesn't exist. And so I think there's so much judgment about people either having too much control, not enough control when it comes to food. And we're so stuck on seeing it in relation to the symptoms that we just miss the universal core elements that are a part of our core humanity that any of us can relate to with the struggle of an eating disorder, because it presents in this very specific way externally that I think there's a lot of judgment about.
Yeah. And as you were even saying that and thinking about control too, I was thinking about how whenever I would explain eating disorders, so I would go in and I taught in high schools a lot. I would do that unit for a lot of the health teachers are like, I am not equipped to talk about this. We want a professional. And so then they would give me, 60, maybe 75 minutes to cover eating disorders as an entire topic. And okay, let's do this. But at least they're bringing someone else in that can answer more informed questions, things like that. But I would always talk about the spectrum of disordered eating and how eating disorders are a really small subset of the spectrum. They're, when things get very severe, we're talking about clinically diagnosable. There are physical, mental, emotional health risks, all these things we need to assess. But there's also this entire spectrum that we have from 1 to 99 that also really isn't talked about and is often normalized. And so I wonder, as you were talking about this, I'm like, do we also not want to address it because we basically promote over control until it becomes a clinical problem? Like, here's the new diet. Here's the thing to do. You should be controlled and rigid and losing weight and not eating this, or eat all these things and do this and be more free with your food. So kind of that over under control. But then if you end up not doing that, according to whatever our constructs are, our diet culture, our wellness culture, whatever it is, then there's judgment. You couldn't do it right. Everybody else is dieting and they're fine. Everybody else is, appropriately shaming themselves into food restriction. You just couldn't handle it and now there's a problem. And if we talk about it, I wonder if it would make us all then have to address the elephant in the room, which is that all of us engage in some form of disordered eating and or are a part of a system that promotes disordered eating. And if we're going to talk about eating disorders, we also have to talk about that.
Yeah. And I think I would even zoom it out. I mean, to go even more globally about that is like, we're part of a system that finds our sort of felt experience quite unbearable. And we will do anything to distract ourselves from that. And so, eating disorders are just a part of that cultural messaging that, in terms of, and I think you're right that it moves into the shame piece, right? Because it's like, if we all need to be managing and controlling ourselves in various ways, eating being one of them. So if we fail at that, and we have a disorder, we don't want to know about that. And I think that goes across the spectrum for mental health challenges.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's then, like you said, I think it's a both and. As a system, everybody's supposed to kind of function within some sort of scope of normal. And then individually, we feel this shame of, if I can't keep up with that, I have to hide it. And so, I mean, I even think about the small examples of like, if you get a toothache, you would rather be afraid and avoid eating on that side of your mouth and go to the dentist and figure out what's actually going wrong and get treatment. And so this idea of, I'm so afraid of what the reality is, I'm afraid of whatever's going on, partially because then it's I would suppose the fear of, how did it get to that point? When we think about food and we think about our relationship to our body, nobody wakes up and goes, I want to restrict, this feels cool. Wondering, what is that ultimately linked to? And like you said, if we're sort of pain averse, gosh, that's got to be the most painful thing to have to turn and look at.
Yeah. I think that, I just think it's a huge challenge. And I think that with eating disorders, and I mean, I think of eating disorders as, as any mental health challenge, is like an amazing protector. I mean, so if we could actually see it as in terms of the service that it holds, and if we could honor how we all have needed to navigate food and our bodies in a way, or our emotions in a way, to stay connected, to stay in contact, and to feel loved, then if we could allow for more contact with that within ourselves, I think we could have so much more compassion and openness to talking about, the struggles of eating disorders. And even more importantly, as you're saying, the struggles of what really lies beneath that.
Which I think is an interesting thing, because one of the conversation points that always comes up is sort of a correction, or I guess maybe a shift, because I think a lot of people do have such a perception of eating disorders about who gets them, why they get them. And again, I think that judgment and that blaming piece. And this happens, I think, in the addiction world in general. Whenever we see that, we obviously see a lot of judgment towards drug addiction, substance use, things like that too. And so I'm curious, what do you think are some of the myths, the misconceptions that you've come across either with clients, people you talk to, or just thinking about the listeners here right now, that we could kind of shift some of that language and perspective around? So maybe this doesn't feel like it's an othering thing, but more just this is an everyone thing that we all need to talk about, whether we are clinically diagnosed with it or not. We need to be talking about food and our bodies and our relationship with that even more.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think, I guess I would like to go back to the word control in that, because I think that, and it's something we use a lot in the eating disorder field, that language, even like this is your child's desire for control. But I think that if we could shift the language on that and think about, why do we reach for control, or why do we get out of control? And the reason that we do that is because of often an underlying terror, or as we talked about, an underlying pain that is so unbearable. And if we could begin to release that idea, yes, of course, there's an element of trying to control things that is a part of the eating disorder. And yet, if we think about a child who's like terrified versus if we think about a child who's like grabbing for control, who are we more empathetic towards?
Right.
We're empathetic towards a terrified child. So if we think about the terror that lies beneath and the deep pains that people are holding, I think, and we start to just release the control narrative, I think that could be a beginning of a shift in the getting to know a different part of the struggle.
I think that's such an interesting perspective I'm thinking about too. So my daughter and I both she's 4. She's never been called out of school. And I was thinking about this Thursday morning when I dropped her off. And then I got a call about 30 minutes in saying, she's fine. She doesn't have a temperature, but she doesn't seem like herself. Something is off. If you could pick her up early, my guess is she'd rather be home with you than be at school. She doesn't seem like she wants to be here. Okay, cool.
What a wonderful school you go to.
It was great. I love it. They're so thoughtful. They're like, we've got her. And if you can come get her, like they're very much, we guide through social emotional learning and experiencing. And part of that is all them having these conversations. Lo and behold, come Thursday night, she and I are both down with a fever. We got hit with this terrible virus that took us out. We've spent Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. It was pretty much just she and I. My husband was home here and there, but he had to work in the emergency department. And so overnight shifts leading to daytime sleeping, all this. So he's helping as he can, but mostly it's she and I locked up in a house where you can't really do anything. You don't really want to do anything, but you're stir crazy because part of you wants to do something. I mean, we've all been there. We know this. Well, she started on Saturday night, kind of going into Sunday, but especially by yesterday, just her behaviors were like grade A jerk behavior. I'm like, I don't know if I just need one of those pills that you can take for like a minute. I just want to forget I'm a mom. Like, I want to know she's safe before I take the pill and then take it for a second to just forget I'm a mom for like an hour. I just need a break. This has been really hard. We're being woken up 3, 4, 5 times a night. She's, coughing. She's got all this, but now she's just being a dick. And this is really hard to show her empathy when she's treating me like garbage. And one of the conversations that I was having with my husband is I said, I am so aware that everything she is doing is a result of feeling so trashed. She hasn't been able to do her normal things. She feels like crap in her body. She doesn't know how to move through this. She wants to leave the house, but we try to leave the house for even just a walk outside and she just wants to go lay down. Like she doesn't know how to make sense of this experience. And instead of being able to process that, she's just being a jerk towards me because it's the only place that she can do it. I get it. It becomes increasingly hard to show her empathy when I feel like I am the constant target of that. But the key point of, oh my goodness, she's just trying to communicate with me. Like last night, she woke me up in the middle of the night and she's like, I heard a loud sound. I know she didn't because I was still awake from the last time she had woken me up. And I know there was no loud sound. Our bedrooms are 5 feet apart. And instead of getting mad, having to stop and going, oh gosh, you're trying to get something and you don't know how to get it anywhere else. And I think when you take that step back and I can say, gosh, I don't like her behavior, the behavior we need to talk about. Even when you feel like trash, we can choose something different. But the emotion underneath it, that's the part that I need to tune into and respond to. And I know that's not the same thing because we're talking about shifting her behaviors and conscious decision about being mean or not being mean. But I think it's the same thing.
It is the
We
same
get
thing.
so fixated on what they're doing. So in this case, the eating disorder, they're just trying to control their food, or they're trying to do this, or it's a vanity disorder. They're trying to lose weight to look a certain way. And it's like, oh my goodness. But if you could take all that off and just see what's underneath it, this is a pain that they don't know how to treat. And they are just longing for some form of relief. And we are perpetuating their pain by getting fixated on the part on the outside.
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think is just, and actually when you're describing your daughter and that experience, it takes me to like part of the drivers of how we develop eating disorders and other disorders, because inherently, fundamentally, we live in a culture where we can't get our needs met. We can't get our emotions met, right? It doesn't exist. The way in which we live in this present time.
In this hustle, busy culture.
Right. With one or two adults taking care of like 1 or 3 children, whatever it is, right? Versus like 15 adults taking care of like a few children, as it used to be. Right. So it's impossible. But then when we are evolutionary programmed to say, this doesn't feel right. I don't feel good. And then, of course, from such a compassionate stance, like we as caregivers, you have all this training. You're so done so much work to be able to parent this little dick that you're dealing with right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I get this, but it's like even you, like you're like very resourced, like you're at the end of your rope, right? And so, like, of course, we respond with irritation, with like you don't need that, with you don't hear that, with you don't feel that, with you don't want to eat that, right? With all of these denials of a kid's experience, right? And so, and what you're saying is that it's separate from the behavior. You can stay steady with the behavior, but the validation of the experience is essential, right? And so inherently on the spectrum, like none of us are getting our needs met when we have the strongest disorders. I mean, there's so many things that goes into what creates an eating disorder versus just our standard dysfunctional relationship with food in our body.
With food, yes.
But, one piece of that we can actually do something about is what you're saying is how we respond to someone who's struggling. And we're talking about prevention here, Your daughter is like, that's preventative care you're offering, right? Is like, I hear you're really, you feel so overwhelmed right now. It's so hard to sleep. Doesn't mean you're going to say you don't have to sleep. Doesn't mean you're going to say you can act that way. Right. But it's like really, really honoring the experience. And that's what we struggle with because we live in a culture where like, come on, get over it. You've got this. You can do it, but we miss the piece about like, this is really hard. You're really, really struggling. And that fundamentally is like one thing we can do to shift how we respond to our children and how we respond to people that we love in order to begin to change the way that we navigate, because it's that overwhelm of feelings that can lead us to need to turn to these. And there are other things. I don't mean to minimize it. That's the only piece. That's one piece, but that's the piece we have control over, that can protect us. And then from moving into needing someone else to validate us or a food or a drug or something else, to use to try to regulate our nervous systems.
One, I think, so 2 things, even as you were saying it. One, realizing that when it did get to that point, going, I just want something to help me forget this for a minute.
Yeah.
And so knowing how quickly that comes in,
Mhm.
because now I'm having emotional needs that my 4-year-old should never be expected to validate or take care of. And they're still there. And so when I'm trying to navigate hers and I'm not getting mine met because it's me and her, and that's again, not her job, then you see how quick that thought comes in. And that
Right.
for me, I think I'm hyper aware because I'm now 10 plus years in my eating disorder recovery of my go-to is something like that. When she goes to bed, like, fuck you, I'm going to eat all the ice cream that I want and I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to body shame myself for the next 3 or 4 days and I'm going to silently restrict food. And I'm going to, like, my brain can still jump there, even though I'm a decade plus into the recovery,
Mhm.
because there's just some sort of correlation then to, I mean, for me, it was just the validation of then my feelings were validated because I'm eating this ice cream and I was taught emotional eating and then emotion stuffing.
Mhm.
So you don't feel your emotions, you pretend everything is fine, and then you just emotionally eat. And that was sort of what was modeled to me. And so I think about that, first of all, from what you said of, gosh, how quickly my brain went to that of, I just want a moment to forget,
Right.
and how if we're not conscious of that, how that becomes it. And the second thing you said that I think is key is as we're sort of thinking about what was going on for her and thinking about how she's feeling that, again, I was able to say, essentially, this is what you're feeling. I completely get it. This is so overwhelming. I don't want to have to do these things. I'm frustrated. I can't sleep. And making the decision to be mean in response to that is still a choice that you're making.
Mhm.
So let's talk about other choices we can make when you feel this way, because you're going to keep feeling this way. And that
Mm.
we're not trying to take that away. And I think that was the other piece is I think some people forget that when somebody else experiences a painful emotion, because they're so averse to feeling their own pain, they've maybe been taught the stuff it method or the, cover it up with something else method. The kind of point then is to go in and you're like, oh yeah, you're feeling this way. Let's fix it.
Mm.
Let's make it go away. The reality is she feels like shit.
Mhm.
She's still up coughing all night long. Everything feels hard for her. This has been a really rough week. I can't stop her from feeling like shit right now. She's going to feel like shit.
Mhm.
So instead, be with her in it and then also help her understand when that's happening. There's some other really awesome tools that we can try that feel better than treating me like garbage, because that's not going to help. It feels like it will, it just won't help. And so it sounds to me like the other key thing that we're not doing, besides even just naming it, is then allowing that emotion to take center stage for a little bit so it actually can be validated so that she can move through it, or any of us can move through it, instead of ultimately stuffing it and then being controlled by it later on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to just back up to one thing that you just said there, Kyira, which is about you having that reaction, right? And you wanting that respite. I want a pill. I want a food. I want something.
Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
part of that is also is like, think about that. So here you're saying that your husband is working like night shifts and is like away and not there. Right. And so you're relying on right there in that moment. You're like, I've got me right now. And so,
Yep.
of course, it's a question of like, who's resourcing you to resource her, right? And so then there's the piece, right? So you reach for something, you're reaching for contact, or you're reaching to escape, of course, because you want to break, right? But when you're alone and when you're on your own in a moment, it's really, really hard to get that sort of contact. And so, of course, you turn to food or wanting a pill or something. Yeah.
Yes.
The first place in that is like, of course you want that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
We all do. We
Right.
need a respite. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right. And I think that maybe for many people, and I don't know your experience with your clients, but for a lot of people that would end up in the therapy room with me with diagnosed eating disorders, when we really would, because we would talk about that. Like if we were just addressing the behaviors, we could do that now. Like we could stop you from binging, purging, restricting, taking diuretics, laxative, whatever it is. We could stop that behavior pretty quickly. That ultimately isn't the issue. Sure, maybe it's what's like causing some clinical concern or some like physical concerns and your doc's bringing you in or whatever. But the problem is this underneath pain and this constant feeling like it didn't get seen or didn't get validated or never knowing what to do with it in a healthy and supportive way for you, whatever that looks like. And so I know when we would finally get to that point, I feel like I don't want to do an all or nothing statement, but let's go maybe 98 or 99% of the people I worked with, that patterning started when they were young of not feeling seen, not feeling validated, and trying to resource wherever they could to feel okay. And for some of them, that was, if I just look better. I mean, we're in a culture of, if change the way you look, change the way you act, you'll feel better. And maybe that led them down a path of over under control with food that caused something. But for many of them, it was more of just, I didn't know anything else to do.
Yeah.
I would eat and it would feel better, or I got so uncomfortable and I felt sick and I didn't eat and that felt better. Or like our relationship with food becomes the focal point we talk about, and people should just be able to handle it better, and they should just eat or just stop eating. Because that's, of course, everybody's prescription they give to people with eating disorders is, well, they should just stop doing this or start doing this, instead of going, oh my goodness, you had no other choice to regulate these very painful things than to grab for food. Or to somehow try to control the way you looked, because then maybe at least you would feel less shitty about that when everything else feels so overwhelming and terrible.
Yeah. And I would even go further than that. Like, of course you did. And thank goodness you did, actually. Because if you hadn't, it could have been much worse, right? Like, you might have killed yourself.
Yes.
If you hadn't, right? Like, so this has been an incredible way of adapting and keep yourself safe and protecting yourself.
Oh, what a key statement. For wherever anybody hearing that right now, it's some people listening are going to be in their own eating disorder recovery, maybe struggling with an eating disorder right now. But even somebody listening that's like, no, that's not me. Again, just thinking about however we have learned to get through and survive our pain, we need to acknowledge that. We need to, and maybe say, and it's not working anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's okay that we decide that this is no longer what we want, and we do the hard work. And gosh, it is what got you through that. I think that I'm so glad you said that. That's such a powerful statement to make. And I think it also doesn't inadvertently shame us as the clients by thinking, well, so then you should have done something different, and how didn't you know to do something better? And then they just layer that on to even more shame.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that moves into also like really moving into a place of thinking about the different parts of ourselves. And I think that traditionally in eating disorder treatment, in my training, 18 years ago, was that the eating disorder was externalized. Like, this was something like, the language of ed. And I mean, and it's very helpful.
Yeah.
And it's very meaningful. And yet I think when we can get to know this as a really important part of ourselves and not externalize it, it can be de-shaming and empowering. Because when it's external, it's like, oh, I'm not, I mean, and again, I'm not, like, I think that can be useful for people. And so whatever works, right? There are so many ways.
Yeah.
And yet I do think that when we think of this as like a part of ourselves that was this incredible protector that kept us safe for so long, that is not keeping us safe anymore. Now that's causing, it's causing some real challenges for us. It's causing some real problems. I think it's such a reframe in terms of having a compassionate stance towards that part of ourselves and really getting to know it and how it's needed to function and how hard it was and how unbearable it may have been for the part that it's protecting, right? From the part that was in so much pain or was so afraid. And that, so this other part comes in and turns to food as a way of really, really managing and navigating an unmanageable situation.
I think about that with how many times I was asked to, and then when I worked in a partial hospitalization, I asked clients, adolescents, to write those goodbye letters to their eating disorders. And that's like, I mean, the 5 most common exercises in eating disorder treatment. I think a goodbye letter is definitely in the top 5, especially with kids and with young adults.
Yeah.
And I had, that was the thing, just sort of witnessing my own resistance and experiences and then watching that in the faces of other people. I don't think I really made the connection until you said that just now, and sort of thinking about internal family systems work and this idea of sort of integrating the parts of self instead of shaming them, dismissing them, whatever. The part that was always so scary was like, But where the fuck were all of you when I had my eating disorder? Because on a shitty day, you weren't there. And I'm not saying that as then shaming my mom or shaming my grandma or shaming friends or shaming a partner that couldn't be there. What I'm saying is you weren't there, not to make you feel bad, but factually, I was alone.
Mm.
And this part of me, which I never claimed it as that until now, I think very directly, gave me everything that you guys couldn't. And sure, maybe it was a fucked up route it took to get there. And no, I don't wish this was the rest of my life where I always have to be mindful that that part will get activated and will try to protect me through food, like it just did this weekend. And knowing that, I have to be vigilant about saying, gosh, thank you. I'm okay. This is just a cold. We'll be okay. But I think that like that asking of somebody to basically create a persona for their eating disorder and then get rid of it is realizing that's not possible. And for many people, that's been the only voice of comfort that they've had. Even if anybody on the outside looks at it and goes, well, that's effed up. You know, it's hurting you. It's killing you. Yeah, sure. But so do many other toxic relationships. This is still the only point of love and security, connection, control, whatever you want to say that I had. And now you're asking me to give it up and to trust everyone outside of me, which I've already created the belief that I can't trust them because they won't be there. So you're giving me nothing. Ooh, yeah, that's so powerful what you just, and I really don't think in all of my clinical years I've ever even made that connection fully until right now.
Wow. Wow. Yeah. It's so beautiful. And the way you connect it is so beautiful. I mean, it's so, and that's it. Like, I don't know about you, but anything I've tried to get rid of myself, and I've tried,
Yeah.
tried to get rid of a lot.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It did, you know? And so you're right that goodbye letter, again, so well-intentioned and coming from what we've known so far, right? We're constantly evolving as clients and as, you know, as humans and as therapists and as, you know, in the research, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work for most to be able to get rid of something. We have to replace it and we have to reassign it. We have to really love it up and like get to know it and invite it in. And as you're saying, it's like, even this weekend, it's like, oh, hey, there you are.
Yeah.
There you are.
Yeah.
And it's like Sharon Salzberg, I think the meditation teacher, she says at some point, it's like when people think about becoming expert meditators, they're always like, well, my mind isn't silent. I've been meditating for like 10 years and my mind is still not silent. So like, what's going on? And she says that it's not that, you know, you're still going to have the thoughts, you're still going to have the distractions, but maybe instead of like inviting them in to live with you, right? You could just invite them in for a cup of tea and then send them on their way. You know, it's like that. How do you relate differently to that part of you from a place of real love? And that also is what can begin to eat away at and like calm down those feelings of shame a little bit.
Yeah. And I think for me, the term cognitive diffusion comes to mind. And so I think about that principle of basically how do we disconnect from our thoughts? And I am such a visual person. And so one of the things that I would always share with, again, I worked with adults as well, but when I moved out to Portland and I had to re-get my licensure out here, I worked at a partial hospitalization clinic. And most of the kids that I worked with were about 12 to 15, 16 years old. And one of the things that I think I was really good at was being very appropriately honest with them and sharing some of my own stuff, but also just being real about the fact that like life is really hard and none of us really know what we're doing. The best thing that we can do is to create space so we don't feel so alone while we're trying to figure it out. And for me, one of the things that I learned was if I could imagine, I had this really annoying neighbor growing up. Again, looking at it now, I think she just was longing for connection and lived in a home where love and security and predictability were really difficult for her to ever have. Like, I think she lived in a state of constant intermittent reinforcement, probably some abuse and things that when I'm 11, I didn't know. I was just annoyed that she would invite herself over all the time because I wanted to play with some of these other kids. But I think about that now. And for a while, I would equate my eating disorder thoughts or my shame thoughts to kind of that character. But then it sort of got twisted into this like creepy, weird looking cat. And with like a black cloak. I think I had some Harry Potter influences in there, but it would come over every day, 2-3 times a day, and invite itself over and bring me a bouquet of black balloons. And each balloon represented some sort of dooming thought, some sort of thing. And me and my shame was in this constant part of my adaptation was people pleasing. So I was constantly trying to meet everybody else's expectations. What my grandma wanted, what my teachers wanted, what my friends wanted, what society at large that I presumed that they wanted for how I look, act, whatever it is. And so then I equated it to basically saying, so then they hand you the black balloons, and instead of saying no, thank you, you hold them. And now you've got a huge thing of black balloons in front of you. You can kind of see through them, but not really. And each one of those balloons is some sort of negative thought, self-doubt, these rules, these pressures, whatever it is. And then I'll hold them all day. And then lo and behold, 4 or 5 hours later, they're coming back with another bouquet of balloons. And I just keep holding them and holding them and holding them. And so what I had to learn is I've got to release those. And the control I had was to not let the thoughts be something I held on to, but I don't have control over the fact that those thoughts are going to come back. And so I think that's maybe sort of what she's saying is like, that's going to keep happening. Is like, it's very infrequent now that my eating disorder comes over, but it still comes over with its own bouquet because it thinks it's helping me so that I'm not alone. And my choice is then to say, thank you. I'm not going to take these balloons. And I appreciate you coming over, instead of taking them and then seeing life through that lens and then getting stuck back in that cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you touch on a really important point in talking about that experience for you, and also about your treatment of adolescence and just the trust. You spoke about trust, right? And if you think about another core element of having an eating disorder is a loss of trust of self and a loss of trust of others. And so and also a feeling of aloneness. And so what you described is so beautiful. I mean, just that description of the black bouquet of balloons is so beautiful. And yet when I really held on to in that too, is like that experience with the adolescence of like sharing of yourself and being real and being honest, right, about the struggle and about the challenge, and just having a lot, and just because so much of treatment is trying to rebuild a trust of self and a trust of others. And so for us as therapists, being really honest and being really real about that, it builds trust, and I think it undoes, or it neutralizes at least that feeling of aloneness. Right. Of like, I get it. I actually feel that too. Like I struggle in these ways as well, not for the purpose of disclosure for using a client,
right,
your therapist, but for the purpose of saying like, yeah, we're all in this, like in this challenging human existence.
Yeah. Well, and I think it is that piece of like, one of the things that I think anyone that hasn't struggled with an eating disorder, or maybe had a loved one, or has worked with someone, if you're not intimately aware of what eating disorders are, or haven't gone through the process, I think there's sort of this misconception that they're, again, sort of the people that they took dieting too far, or they took, whatever too far, or they just ate too many donuts and now they just constantly eat too many donuts and they don't know how to stop. And so we really reduce that experience to food. And it's a really interesting thing because I think it's the only addiction that we really focus on that. Like if we think about somebody with substance use, it's not like, well, gosh, that person was like, heroin's the best thing on the planet. I'm just going to dabble a little bit and see if I can do it. And then I got stuck there. They're the same feedback loops in the brain of just trying to find, whether it is escape, validation, whatever it is the brain trying to cope with something that usually has nothing to do with whatever that substance was. And so it's just sort of the best resource available to them at the time, or the most accessible given whatever they have around or where, whatever it is. And so I think about, as you're talking about this, for so many people, that loss of trust, it's not a connection back to, well, we need to learn how to build our relationship with food, or we need to like our bodies. It's, at least for me, so much of that was a secure attachment to myself, a sense of healthy interpersonal dynamics and relationships, the practice of being able to say a boundary and have somebody hear it
Mm-hmm.
ever,
Yeah.
without either pushing past it or kind of walking around it or pretending like they didn't hear it. And I think that's the part where if we can come to that, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, but it's like, gosh, everybody's experienced that. Again, that doesn't mean everyone's going to have an eating disorder. What we're saying is that the people that develop those eating disorders ultimately probably were tasked with that so often that their brain went into basically last ditch effort survival mode to try to manage that pain. And could you imagine that to some degree? And I don't really have a question, but I'm just thinking about sort of the rawness of that I think we miss in these conversations because we just get so fixated on it from the food perspective. Like we're focused on the behavior and not on that piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, one of the things about that we see across the spectrum with people with eating disorders and, other mental health challenges, but certainly with eating disorders is like, it may be that the environment is the same as somebody else. It may not have been worse. And yet,
Right.
And yet these tend to be super feelers. Like we tend to be people who are highly attuned and highly sensitized and sensitive in the most beautiful of way. I mean, I think about people with eating disorders often it's like they're the canary in the coal mine. Like they're suffering a message to us about what we are not doing right in our world, in our society, in terms of like, it feels so bad. It's so hard that I'm going to turn to this thing to try to help me to manage how attuned I am really. And so if we could begin to really connect with the superpower of that and like the incredible way in which people who have eating disorders tend to navigate the world, right? If we could begin to honor that differently, my God, I mean, first of all, we would have a very different world that we're living in. We would be able to just honor that experience that lies beneath those symptoms,
I think what you just explained too is because one of my questions for people listening is, again, so we sort of talk about dysfunctional relationships with food in our body and how that's a much more normal experience than the percentage of people diagnosed with an eating disorder. And a lot of times it's, again, it's diet culture, it's body shame, there's all these other pieces, and those are really important topics to talk about. And this is such a different experience that we're talking about. And I think you said a few key things of just that loss of trust, that loss of security, that deep loneliness. And then it sounds like that other layer is really recognizing the intensity with which they experience the world and what that looks like in a world that actively works to detach from and avoid having those big feelings conversations.
Yeah.
And so it is that piece right there that we need to redesign that system to allow emotions and feelings to be more a part of the conversation, but also to recognize these are the people that are likely the high functioning, high performing. You're looking at them like, I don't know how they do it all. And they are crumbling and they feel like they are the people that have to keep doing that because they're trying to feel and heal so much pain for other people and haven't been taught how to validate or move through theirs and or how to release some of the intensity of other people's feelings that they're having.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So just kind of thinking about this from the standpoint of, okay, if we could all shift one thought, do one thing. Again, I don't want to reduce this to, well, it's all fixable in a day if everyone does this, because that's not what it is. But it does sound like the thing that we're hitting at kind of repeatedly is that empathy is sort of a marker that we need to cultivate more of and more space for emotional processing, feeling, validate, whatever it is, but some sort of depth. Is there something that you would invite people listening to this to do or to feel or to bring into their lives that would allow that to just start to ripple out, that might make some of this work more accessible from a cultural level?
Well, I go to where I go in my mind is to more of a systems thinking. So I think I'm resistant to going to like the individual and what the individual needs to do, because I feel like that's where so much of the emphasis is put in terms of like that the individuals need to just do this better. And I'm not saying that what you're saying, but so I go,
totally.
I go to the system and I think about parents, I think about partners, I think about siblings, aunts, uncles, grandparents, loved ones. And one of the ways in which I work is using something called emotion-focused family therapy, and really responding, like how can we, when we are with someone, and this isn't maybe speaking so much to the people who are struggling with an eating disorder, but if you are with someone who is struggling with an eating disorder or other like high emotional attunement, like where someone's very sensitive, right? It's like the first place we go, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, but the first place we are trained to go as a parent, like I do this, and you didn't with your daughter, you talked about this. It's like the first place where we think to go is go to like, you've got this, you can handle it. And then we get problem solving, right? And that's great. But the missing piece and what you did the other night, even in your state of like, oh my God, I can't handle this anymore. I can't take this anymore. Was you allowed her space and you were able to tolerate enough within yourself to be like, oh my gosh, this is so hard, right? You're able to like experience. And so I would just say that the first place is like, if you're around someone who's struggling with an eating disorder, is to really try to avoid going to cheerleading or solutions, actually. And it comes from a place of love, but to really begin with validation, like a deep validation of the person's experience. And what we know from the research in neuroscience and from the emotion-focused family therapy is that 3 because statements, like saying it 3 times, is the magic number. And so when someone is saying like, oh, I feel really, really bad about my body or something, we want to go to, oh, your body's great, or, oh, you not, to focus on the symptom, but to really honor the person's, it's so hard that you feel fat right now when you're sitting in this room because you want to fit in. And when you feel fat, you feel like you don't fit in. And because this is a struggle that you've been having for a long time, and it's so hard that you haven't shaken it yet. And because, you're getting all this messaging that you should feel differently or you should be changing, and you're not changing. And that feels really hard for you, right? So just really trying to just take a moment to be with the person where they are starts to like literally put like water on a fire, like calming down the nervous system that begins to allow people to regulate, and then go on with your cheerleading and your, problem solving if you must. But, I think that one of the things we need to do is really slow things down and stop trying to sort of problem solve and tell people what to do. I mean, this is I'm not talking about therapy. This is an important piece of the therapeutic process too. And yet we're much more comfortable doing it in the therapy room. And it's very hard to do in our relationships when we see someone struggling, because we desperately want to pull them out of it,
Yeah. Well, and honestly, even in the therapy room, because you sometimes, if you haven't dealt with your own shame and your own pressure that you need to be the one to fix it and solve it, instead of realizing that's an ego-driven thing, and that's you believing that your worth and value as a therapist is only by fixing everything for everyone else. So then I've done it in the therapy room too, where I'm like, okay. And I can feel myself. It was the one piece of critical feedback. I mean, obviously I've had to grow and evolve in so many ways, and I've gotten amazing opportunities to learn and to flop royally. But the one piece of feedback that was consistent and the most helpful for me was a supervisor saying, I can see that you have a lot of pain and your way of coping is to not feel emotions. And I'm like, well, this is supervision. This is not therapy. And I'm like immediately resisting it. And I was like, okay, why? And she goes, because you never sit with the emotion in the room with your client. You always move to fix it. And the deeper we dove, I realized it was because I thought they would be safer if they could hide it or fix it.
Yeah.
And so I say that just to say there's probably people listening that are practitioners that are doing this all the time.
Yes. I do.
And my shame would have told me, 5 years ago, probably even 5 months ago, would have said, yeah, and now see, let's catalog all the ways that you're failing as a therapist, as a parent, as a partner, because I do this. But it's not that. I think it's what you said that is so key. And I'm so glad that you made that clarification. It's very easy for all of us to be like, well, this is a me problem to fix and solve.
Mm-hmm.
I've got to be better at this. I've got to do these things. No, this is a system issue. And the system has created a belief in all of us that we are only worthy and valuable if we keep doing and moving. And that means that emotions get in the way. So we've been conditioned to believe that cheerleading and problem solving is the best way to save everyone around us and ourselves, because we got to keep them going or else they're going to get left behind. Mm-hmm. And so instead we have to go, well, fuck. We can stay here. There is no such thing as behind. This place can be okay too. I'm not going to follow the system. So there's still a charge inside of us to change our behaviors, but it's more recognizing we're just taking ourselves out of this rat race that we aren't comfortable in either, let alone the people we're talking to that are also struggling with their own things as well. And it's okay to stay there. Yeah. It's okay to be there for a little bit. You'll know when it's time to move forward, but you've been running so long. I think it's Brene Brown that says that, where it's like, we just keep moving, hoping that we're just going to outrun our shame. And we have yet to just sort of stop and realize that doesn't happen. Yeah. So now we're even more burnt out and exhausted because we keep running, but the same outcome is going to happen no matter when we stop.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that, right, it takes like 90 seconds for a feeling to come to completion. But we never complete it, right?
No.
So we don't. So like that fear of being left behind even, right? It's true that we're so focused on them. And yet actually, like if we must frame it within our capitalist society, within our project-oriented, like if we need to bring in, like if we need to sell that idea, actually, if we can just sit with and bear with and support the people around us to like be in that pain, to be in that, we actually have the possibility of moving through it where we could actually get some shit done.
Yes. Oh, I've learned that when I get little like dopamine hits, they feel like pop rocks in the front and the side of my brain. And I just got that. And I think it's because of just the very real way in which, we haven't even talked about, this is what anorexia is. This is what it happens. This is what treatment is. And we could do that. But the reality I think that we did is we humanized something that we've tried to put in a container to detach from the reality of what's underneath it. And so we've brought the connection to these diagnoses by trying to build empathy around pain and trying to really understand that this is not a disorder of control, of vanity. This is not somebody just trying to look a certain way or because they're so rigid. This is somebody that is in pain, whose brain and body is trying to survive the best way they know how and what they need. Again, trying not to make an all or nothing statement, but likely what they're missing is what you just said, that ability to complete the cycle. And oftentimes to complete the cycle with someone else around in the beginning, because they aren't there yet where they can trust, like I was able to move through it on my own, but that is still 10 plus years of working on my recovery and still having a really long way to go. And it took me about 3 hours to get through it all because I go through every cycle of wanting to detach, then cataloging all the reasons I'm a shitty parent and what I should have said that I didn't say and how I'm supposed to be better. And now all the things I didn't get done because I'm sitting here cataloging how I'm a shitty parent, and you just keep going. And I wish I could be done in 90 seconds. I'm not there yet. And for many people, they do need somebody on the outside to sit with them so they can start to go through it until they've built the capacity to do it on their own. And so, okay, I'm super mindful of our time. I know we need to kind of bring this to a close. All of that to say, if you were listening to this again in 6 months, or let's say that you have a client and they stumbled on this and they're listening to this, what is one thing you would like to leave people with? Just one note. If their brain is swirling and overwhelmed with everything we've kicked up for them right now, what's one thing you want them to take with them today?
I think the one thing I want them to take with them is that to not give up hope and to hold on to hope, because it's not because you're so broken and unfixable. It's because the healing container isn't strong enough yet. The provider isn't skilled enough to help you, and you haven't gotten what you need. And we're coming for you. And there is more help available. And we are learning as fast as we can if we haven't met you yet.
I love that. Can you say that one more time about the container? Because that, again, I think I got an even bigger dopamine hit of just like, I felt like you just gave so many people a lifeline who've been telling themselves they're broken. So can you say that one more time?
The healing container is not strong enough yet.
Yeah, it's not you.
It's not you.
It's not you.
It's not you. It's your struggle, and it's real.
Yeah.
And it's yours, and you have to do the work. And yet, if you haven't gotten the help you need yet, it's not because you're too sick or unhelpable. It's just not.
Yeah. Yeah. And then to give yourself some grace to realize that we're talking about prevention, and even the idea of prevention with my 4-year-old is really effing hard. Yep. Now imagine that you've been in this for 10, 20, 30 years. You got to also give yourself the grace and space to realize that you can't expect to make this go away in a day. This is about you learning to be in it, feel it, heal it. And it's something that all of us have to do for different reasons. Again, if we're talking about a clinical diagnosis, maybe what support looks like and the journey looks like is different. Maybe there are more people involved. The acuity level is different of what we're struggling with. So what the process looks like is different. But the reality being, I have yet to meet somebody who doesn't have some sort of story rooted in shame that they've spent at least 10, 15, 20 years living in that they are now learning to undo. And so all of us are having to work on that. And I think that piece of realizing that we're all learning to build our containers, we're all learning to trust in those containers and to trust in ourselves. And so to really walk that process with grace and compassion for ourselves and for everyone else, and realizing that we're all doing the best that we can. And hopefully as we keep more conversations like this going, we can stop that rat race upstream and just learn to be in this space together. Erika, this has been amazing. I know there are going to be some people that are listening to this that are really wanting to connect with you more. And so I'm curious, where's the best place for them to get connected with you?
Yeah. The best place is my website, probably. That's the hub of everything, is Erika Malm, ErikaMalm.com. Yeah.
Awesome. And I will make sure that that's in the show notes for everybody so that they can reach out to you directly. Thank you so much for your time, for being a part of this conversation. I always feel weird saying this was such a joy because it's such a hard topic. And the joy, I think, comes from having the conversations you and I both know need to be happening and that we long to see more of in the world. And so I'm so grateful for your vulnerability and your willingness to be here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Kyira. Really appreciate it. It's great to be with you.
Absolutely. And everybody else, as you are wrapping up this episode, remember to reach out to Erika. Her contact information is going to be in the show notes. If you do have questions, if you want to learn more, if you're just starting to figure out what this work looks like, let her know, and she can be a part of maybe helping you build that stronger container. And as you're going, your brain's going to feel swirled with so much information, again, regardless of what you're going through, what's happening. So just come back to taking one thing, whether that's Erika's invitation and her point or something else that really resonated with you. But just take one thing with you today. We don't have to take it all and try to do it all. You can come back to this episode as many times as you want. So for now, just take in that moment, celebrate the fact that you were here in this, and I will see you all back here next Sunday.